Putin himself has barely commented on this at all. He's been invisible.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine and the Kursk incursion, and I'm delighted to be joined by Michael Binyon, leader writer, columnist and foreign correspondent for The Times since 1972. Michael, always a pleasure. Welcome back to Frontline.
Thank you.
Here we are more than 2 weeks into the incursion into the Kursk region. As someone who knows Russia very well, give me your sense of where Vladimir Putin's mindset is at the moment.
I think it's all over the place at the moment. I think he's really embarrassed. He's confused. He's hoping that he can provide a definitive answer to this, but there isn't an easy answer. The obvious solution for Russia, would be to send a massive military force to just drive the Ukrainians out of the region straight away. But he doesn't have the manpower quickly available. They're sending conscripts, which of course is causing a certain reaction inside Russia, a very unfavorable reaction. And I think Putin is both furious and embarrassed. Furious with his own generals and chiefs of staff who haven't prepared for this, who haven't secured the borders, and embarrassed because it does look as though Russia is vulnerable, something that he's always said Russia is secure and firm and can, look after its own defence. And that clearly doesn't seem to be the message that's come out.
And in terms of the choices he's now faced with, I mean, all of them carry political problems. He can divert troops from the front line in the east of Ukraine, but clearly that's not ideal. He can use conscripts, but again, that comes with political costs. Or he could launch a fresh wave of mobilisation, but again, politically very risky.
Exactly. You said exactly the three things that are very difficult for him, and those are really the only three options. His favoured response would be a massive military counterstrike to really hit the Ukrainians hard and push them straight out again. That's probably what the Ukrainians themselves have been expecting, and they're probably ready to withdraw quickly if needed, partly to save their own manpower and partly to secure their position as a force that could strike back but are not there to occupy territory but to show the Russians that they're vulnerable. But the other one, as you say, conscripts, well, they are already, it seems, sending some conscripts into the region, and that's caused a massive reaction. The mothers of Russia, who up to now have been surprisingly quiet, have begun to say, look, this is not what we were told. Our sons and our young ones are not there to be on the front line, and this is the front line. Well, it is now. And the final thing, which is to bang the patriotic drum and get everyone gang together, doesn't seem to be working because there's a lot of surprisingly open criticism in the Russian media of this blunder, the fact that Russia was unprepared, they didn't see it coming, and that they haven't really had proper border reinforcements.
It's easy to be wise after the event, because had you told either of us 3 weeks ago, oh, by the way, Ukraine's about to invade Russia, we probably would have, discounted it. But should the Russians, in hindsight, have seen this coming? Should they have expected this could happen?
Probably not, because they felt the Ukrainians were on the back foot, and to some extent they still are. They just don't seem able to have the manpower or the resources, and in particular the weapons, to stop the steady thrust by Russia across this big, broad front all along eastern Ukraine. And the Ukrainians, little by little, have been ceding ground, have been giving up villages, have lost strong points. And the Russians, I think, felt that they've got Ukraine on the run. Maybe not straight away, and maybe there are some setbacks, but in the end, the inevitable result is that Ukraine will be pushed further and further back from the front line. What they didn't anticipate is that Ukraine would be able to gather together and mobilize a strike force which would be diverted to some region not where the Russians are pushing forward, but up north, further north in the Kursk region, and that they would suddenly spring on a surprise on the Russians, which is exactly what they have done. And I think yes, of course, they will be blamed for bad intelligence, bad defense, but to be fair to them, I don't think they could have seen this coming.
You made a really interesting point a moment ago, Michael, about some of the reaction inside Russia, including in the Russian media, that, of course, is so controlled by the Kremlin to a large extent, but has been critical in recent weeks. To what extent will people inside Russia even be aware of the full extent of what's happening in the Kursk region? I mean, clearly it is an informational autocracy. If you're living in Kursk, if you're living in Belgorod Oblast, which has been evacuated, you'll be aware of it. But if you're an ordinary Russian in Moscow, St. Petersburg, or one of the other cities or towns, how aware are you?
Well, not very aware officially, because as you say, there's been a clampdown, and Putin himself has barely commented on this at all. He's been invisible, except that he's done a few walkabouts just recently. And as somebody remarked, only when Putin is under pressure does he go on walkabouts and try to show himself as a real leader, liked by the people, popular, shaking hands, all that sort of thing. Normally he's much more remote, much more secluded, and he hasn't really said much about this. Possibly a sign of embarrassment because he doesn't quite know what he should say. But the fact that there has been a sort of information blackout, it's not a complete blackout, but it's certainly not much detail of what the Ukrainians have gained in the region. That can be undermined by all these people who've fled, who all have relatives all over Russia, or probably many of them do, and word has got back by word of mouth, which is the normal way. People have said, do you know what's happening down there? Let me tell you, my uncle has just told me this and this and this, or whatever it is, and word spreads pretty quickly. So I think a lot of Russians are quite aware of exactly the danger that they've now face and the problem of having lost territory for the first time since the Second World War.
Which is a huge humiliation. I mean, it does seem not like a deliberate tactic now by the Ukrainians to bring the war quite literally to Russia, not only in terms of this incursion, but also the drone attacks that we've seen on Moscow, and also the fact, you've got Telegram down, you've got WhatsApp down. If you're living in Russia, it's becoming more apparent that all is not well.
I think that's absolutely clear, yes. I mean, the drone attacks on Moscow probably don't inflict much damage. It's clearly demoralizing to think that from far away, from, 1,000 miles away or whatever it is, they are still able to send something over to cause damage in the capital, which up till now has felt pretty safe. I mean, there have been one or two sporadic attacks up till now. I think that's probably, in terms of Ukrainian tactics, a little bit dubious. It will certainly cause doubts among Ukraine's Western supporters. They've told the Ukrainians, look, we're not here to back an all-out war. We don't want you targeting Moscow or any other big population centers. We are ready to go along with strikes on Russian military establishments, particularly in the border regions, which have happened and where they've used drones to some good effect. But I think the drone attacks, well, they're intended not really to cause damage, but to demoralize Russia and to embarrass the Russian leadership, and they probably have done that. But I think much more the embarrassment is losing territory. I mean, that is the real key thing. That's never happened before, and that certainly is something that the Russians will feel both angry about and probably ashamed.
We've spoken about Putin being pretty paralysed at the moment, but what do you think he will decide to do in the end, Michael?
I think if possible, he would decide on a massive military counterstrike. I think he will be preparing a force that will go straight in enormous numbers and with overwhelming force and weapons. And at the same time, he will probably prepare a huge drone or missile or bombing attack on big cities in Ukraine. I mean, Kharkiv has already been under attack. Kiev comes under regular attack, but I think these will be redoubled, and he will go for the infrastructure, which they've been doing already, trying to knock out all their energy networks and things of that kind. And it will really, the aim is to make it as difficult and uncomfortable for Ukraine as possible, and if possible, cut off their lines of communication to the Kursk region.
How secure do you think his position is at the moment?
Hard to tell. I mean, everybody says, well, this must be embarrassing for him, and I'm sure there are rumblings and this, that, and the other. Who knows? I mean, he's been very much in charge throughout the entire Ukraine war. The attempted rebellion by Prigozhin, the Wagner group, I mean, that was pretty quickly snuffed out and fairly brutally with the guy, assassinated on a plane, clearly brought down by a bomb of some kind. And challenges to Putin are certainly not visible. He is secure in that he's got virtually everybody on his side, or at least the army depends on him. He's been pretty critical of the leadership of the army and various others, and those who failed have been dismissed, some of those who failed. it's hard to see where any challenge to his own power would come from. It's not possible politically to oust Putin. Funnily enough, it was much easier to get rid of a Soviet leader because in the Politburo, all you had to do was to outvote the leader. And that's what happened to Khrushchev. And he was dumped, he was voted out. There's no way of getting rid of Putin constitutionally except by impeachment in the parliament. And of course, with a tame parliament like that, it's never going to happen. The only way of getting rid of him is by a coup d'etat. And that would have to be with the cooperation of the army and the intelligence services and whatever other agencies around could be mobilized to strike against him. And it doesn't look as though that's likely.
Do you think his wider strategy is still to wait until November, to wait until the US election and hope for a second Trump presidency?
Oh, I think that's definitely a factor, yes. I mean, whether a Trump presidency is as guaranteed now as it was 3 months ago is open to question. But I think he does think or feel that the Trump administration, a new one, would be much more indulgent of what Russia is doing. I mean, Trump himself boasted, I'll end this in a few days or so. In other words, I'll just say to Russia, you take what you want. That's the end of it. We'll just tell Ukraine, that's it. No more weapons. You're on your own. Make a deal, which in that circumstance would be a very disadvantageous deal. And I think Putin feels all he has to do is to wait and see. Now, if Trump doesn't win, does he then feel under pressure to make a deal? Or will the Chinese, who are the only ones who could actually push Russia one way or the other, do they think that that would be the time that they would step in and say it's time to actually end this war or not? We really don't know. I don't think there's going to be any movement by Putin, certainly for the next few months.
It's really interesting what you say about the Chinese there. Do you think that Xi Jinping is pretty much the only person on the planet who has the power to pick up the phone to Putin and say, call it off?
Absolutely, yes. Nobody else could. I mean, one or two think that they could be peacemakers. The Turks think, Erdogan thinks that he is in a position to get Putin to agree to some kind of deal, and Turkey could intervene with a proposal for a non-intervention or, ceasefire or whatever it might be. The Turks negotiated a minor deal in the past. They were the intermediaries over the decision to allow Ukraine to export its grain through the Black Sea without being interrupted. But that was a pretty minor deal, and I think the Russians didn't feel they were losing much by it. But in terms of actually ending the war, yes, the Chinese are the only people who have real influence over Moscow, and it depends how they see it, whether they think that having the war as an embarrassment for the West is more worth it than ending what they see as potentially destabilizing conflict that could cost China quite a lot in terms of secondary Western boycotts of their own trade, which they didn't want, they won't want. We'll see. But certainly they are the only ones in a position to pick up the phone and say, time to declare victory and end it.
Let's talk about the Ukrainian side of things. What is your sense of what Ukraine's primary objective is? I mean, increasingly I'm of the view that maybe it's actually designed to send a message to Ukraine's Western allies to go, look, we can cross Putin's so-called red lines and we can prove he's bluffing because he hasn't responded with tactical nuclear weapons or the worst case scenario.
I think you're right. Yes, it certainly is a message to the West. We are not finished. We may have been slowly retreating along the whole of the Eastern Front, but look, we have initiative, we have capability, and we can spring surprises, and we can inflict a serious military and political setback on Russia. And also that we are ready to hold territory as a bargaining chip. I mean, they made it quite clear this is not a long-term objective. They're not trying to occupy Russian territory. And as you say, they are to some extent calling Russia's bluff, because the Russians have said several times, including former President Medvedev, who said that any incursion onto vital Russian interests, including Russian territory, would incur the strongest possible response. In other words, tactical nuclear response. Well, that's not happened, and we hope is not going to happen. So Ukraine is performing useful service in showing up what appear to be bluffs. But the danger of that is it may not be a bluff. There may be a Russian counter-response, and it could be pretty devastating. We don't know. So I think the West is wise to be cautious, but at the same time, it's also being pushed by Ukraine to say, we're not finished yet, give us the weapons, and we will succeed.
And do you think that will work? Do you think the West will, for example, the UK grant the use of Storm Shadow missiles? all kinds of reports that it's waiting on US approval. Do you think the US will allow them to use longer-range ATACMS inside Russia? Do you think that's feasible?
Well, I think the use of weapons may be sanctioned. I mean, what is the West going to do if the Ukrainians just use them anyway?
Yeah.
I mean, better to do it and then say, oh, sorry, we just thought we needed to, rather than seek permission and be told no. So they might use these things anyway. They've been granted them. The bigger difficulty is that the West really doesn't have an endless supply of weapons to give to Ukraine. They've more or less given them everything that's been in store, everything that they can just take off the shelf and give them. Now they need to actually make and build more weapons in order both to resupply their own arsenals and to give something to Ukraine if they're minded to do so. But again, the other problem is, to what extent is Western public opinion now ready to continue supplying Ukraine with money, weapons and support indefinitely? I mean, there are lots of calls. Of course, we must defend them. The security of the West depends on it. But does public opinion really agree with that? I think there's a war weariness in the West.
For how long, Michael, do you think Ukraine can hold the territory it's captured in Kursk? I mean, I was speaking yesterday on Frontline to Major General Chip Chapman. He thinks that they could be able to hold it up to the autumn, even to November potentially. Other people saying they'll tactically withdraw within a few weeks and maybe then look at launching other cross-border raids along other stretches of the border. What is your sense of things?
Well, I think he's right that they could hold it to the autumn. Yes, I think that's right. Whether they want to, it's unclear. The danger about quickly withdrawing is that you then say, well, why did they go in there in the first place? Was it just a gesture? I mean, it wasn't cost-free. I mean, they've lost men in the incursion, and it's also cost quite a lot in weapons. And you sort of think that if they're occupying the area as a bargaining chip, it makes more sense to try to hold on to it. The danger, of course, is the longer you stay, the more time the Russians have to prepare a massive counteroffensive, which could be very devastating in terms of annihilating Ukrainian manpower.
How significant is the transformative effect, and is it a transformative effect, on Ukrainian morale, the events of the past few weeks?
Oh, I think a huge boost to morale. I think Ukrainians have felt, well, we can show them. We can show that we are not finished yet. We can hold Russian territory, and taking the fight to the enemy is something that, you know, all military commanders would like to do. And the question is, do they have the manpower to can do that, and at the same time continue to try to hold the line on the long Eastern Front, where the Russians are still pushing?
And that's a really good point. I mean, we shouldn't forget this. A lot of people who are very pro-Ukraine are understandably excited by the events of the past few weeks, but Russia's still making advances in the east.
They are, yes, and I think that is, to some extent, Putin's tactic. They're not going to give up this push. They're not going to do what the Ukrainians hope, which is pull all their troops out of the Eastern Front and move them back to Kursk to drive out the Ukrainians there. They're going to more or less, for the moment, just sort of forget about Kursk, forget about that region. It's not of territorial significance. It's of symbolic significance, but it isn't key to further advance into Ukraine. But the steady push along the whole of the Eastern Front is effective. It is costing the Ukrainians a lot of weapons and quite a large number of casualties, and I think Putin is determined to keep pushing there. How he solves the Kursk incursion, well, unclear.
When the history books are written about the war in Ukraine, how significant a chapter will the events of the last few weeks be, Michael?
Very hard to tell. It depends what the outcome is. If it does force the Russians into some kind of negotiation about territory, then it would have been a masterstroke. If it's just purely symbolic and they are likely or forced to withdraw and pull all their troops out, then you sort of think, well, what was that for? What was the aim of that? Was it simply to persuade the West to give us more weapons? Maybe, but if the West doesn't come up with more weapons, was it a waste of manpower and a waste of time? I mean, it just depends what it leads to and to what advantage it gives Ukraine in the overall fight.
Michael Binyon, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.